Here we have a solution for Art's kites. Let's take a look at how the reasoning worked. Now, as the case reads, Bob Winward is a hobbyist who makes kites. It talks about how he got into the kites and what kind of money they make, and the fact that he needs $10,000 in order to make his tuition. And so I put this fact, the tuition goal, $10,000, over here on the right side. As you'll see, I like to take all of the facts from the case that are important to building the model and put them on the right. These are the things that generally don't change, but if they do change, you want the model to automatically change to reflect them. So the way that my model is set up, if it turns out that instead of needing 10,000, he actually needs 20,000, I would only change it here. I don't need to go looking in my equations and figure out how that changes. For the same reason, if the material cost changes from $35 to $85, I would change it here, and it's automatically reflected over here on the left. But let's go through the case. So my tuition goal is $10,000. It talks about the fact that he believes he can price his kites between $75 and $150. So that's a max price of $150 and a minimum price of $75. It also talks about the fact that the material cost is $35. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that each one of these cells, instead of just being E1, my cell is also called tuition goal. So I have tuition goal, max price, min price, materials costs, by laser cutter, and so on. The way that you name a cell is you click on the cell, and then you select this box here where it gives you the coordinates and you give it a name. So I can call this named cell. And so later, if I want to use that cell in an equation, I can say equals 2 plus. When I select that cell, instead of using E14 or E15 rather, it uses named cell, and it makes it a lot easier as we move forward to work with our models, when instead of looking at coordinates, we're looking at names that are meaningful to us. But going back to the case, it says that because of the cost of hand cutting, he uses a laser cutter. It would cost $8,500 to buy the laser cutter and $5,000 per year to rent the laser cutter. The string and bobbin set that goes on, that's the part of the kite. The bobbin is the part of the kite that you hold on to. It costs $5. Then there's the issue of where is he going to set up shop. If he rents the kiosk, it's going to cost him $1,000 a month. And if he rents the shop, it'll cost him $1,600 a month. Now, these other facts down here aren't part of the case, but we'll get to those in a minute. So the first thing I need to do with the case is I need to figure out what are the decisions that the person needs to be able to play with to solve this case. Now, in this particular situation, the decisions are what is the price that he charges. Now, the case tells you that his max price is $150 and his minimum price is $75, but he gets to choose what his price is. And so I always put the decisions on the left-hand side in the upper left-hand corner, and I ask that you do the same. So my first decision is price for $150. My next decision is, do I buy or rent the laser cutter, which is kind of why the case gives you both costs. And the final decision is, do I use a kiosk or a shop as my location? So these are the three decisions. I code them in yellow to make them easy to find. When you're handing off your model to the person who's actually going to use it, you don't want them to search around and try to figure out how to use it. You want it to be clear what their decisions are. Now, quantity is an equation that's driven by your decisions. It tells you in the last sentence of the case, the formula is quantity equals 100 plus 40,000 divided by price, which is pretty much the equation that I have here. 100 plus 40,000 divided by decision price. Now, I use the floor equation because otherwise I would potentially get a quantity of 366.6, and he can't sell a fractional part of a kite. So the floor equation rounds it down. It doesn't really make sense to round it up because I might not quite have enough to sell that extra kite. So I now know my quantity, my price, and I have decisions that help drive some of my costs. So we're going to use a standard income statement, as you should have seen in the accounting review. As you know, revenue, the amount of money that you take in, is equal to the quantity sold times the price that it was sold for. So revenue is equal to kite price times kite quantity. Cost of goods sold is equal to my materials cost to make the kite plus the string and bobbin set for each kite. All of that times the kite quantity. And my gross profit is the difference between my revenue and my cost of goods sold. My expenses are the cost of the laser cutter, and we'll get into how we figure that out in a second. The cost of the location, and those two things are my total expenses. Now let's go to the cost of the location, since it's the easier selection. We used an if statement to say, depending on whether the person decided to rent the kiosk or to rent the shop, that's how we know whether we're paying the kiosk rent or the shop rent. Okay? If you're having problems with that, go back and review the video on how to handle the if statement. And so the laser cutter ends up being somewhat of the same thing. So depending on whether or not we decided to buy or to rent the laser cutter, then we are basing our expenses on what the expense would be to buy versus what the expense would be to rent. Now the twist here is, if we are buying a capital good, we don't take the entire cost we paid for it and count it as an expense in this period. We use something called depreciation, which you should have covered in Accounting 1. And the depreciation is based on the depreciation period. So you would take the purchase cost of the laser cutter and divide it by the number of years that you're depreciating it over. So, and that number would be the depreciation expense, which is what you're going to pay for the laser cutter for this year. Else, you're going to pay the rent. Now, because the case doesn't give you a depreciation period, I assume a depreciation period. But whenever you assume, you need to document that in your case as well, in your model as well. And you put it over here on the right so that if the person using the model says, well, no, this is ridiculous, the depreciation period for a laser cutter isn't 5 years, it's actually 3, the model will change automatically to reflect that change. And also, if they say that the depreciation period is actually 10 years, it'll also change automatically in that case as well. So I have my total expenses as my laser cutter plus my location, and my net profit is my gross profit less my total expenses. And finally, we have my taxes. Now, I assumed a tax rate, and because I assumed it, I put it over here, I documented it over on the right. Again, if it turns out that the person is paying less taxes or more taxes, they can change the tax rate and the model will change automatically. And my after-tax profit is my net profit minus my taxes. Now, we've done the basics as far as handling this case and how it works. And this model will allow Bob to play with his decisions and figure out what works best for him in order to make his $10,000. Like, he might look at the model and realize that if he only charges $75 for his kites, and he rents the laser cutter, and he rents the shop, he has just enough money to cover school expenses. If, however, he charges considerably more for his kites, maybe even $150, and instead of renting the laser cutter, he buys the laser cutter, and instead of renting the shop, he rents the kiosk, you can play with it and you can see how the numbers change, and you can find the best solution given the decisions. Alternatively, you can use something called Solver and ask Solver to make the decisions for you. So in a case like this, let's take a look at how Solver would solve this problem. So I go to Data and select Solver, and my objective is my after-tax profit, which I want to be set to a maximum. The cells that I have that are changing are B1, B2, and B3. If this is unfamiliar to you, then you need to go back and look at the intro to Solver and the using Solver parts of this week's lesson. And there are certain constraints. My laser cutter, given that that cell can only be a 0 or a 1, I have to say that it's greater than or equal to 0, it's less than or equal to 1, and the number is an integer in order to force it to make that decision. The same thing with the location decision. It's greater than or equal to 0, less than or equal to 1, and it is an integer to force it to be either 0 or 1. And my decision price is less than or equal to my max price and greater than or equal to my minimum price. And then I can run Solver and have Solver come up with my solution. So actually, let me run it again and run it as evolutionary. Evolutionary is the most advanced part of Solver. It actually tries all of the combinations. Instead of mapping out the equations and trying to solve for simultaneous equations and find the natural intersection of the equations, it actually tries all of the combinations and comes out with the answer that best fits the facts. Now this is going to go off and it's going to try all of these combinations and comes back with the answer. Now I have already found the answer. For this model, it's a fairly simple model. The answer is $150. Buy, don't rent, and rent the kiosk and not the shop. So this is Art's Kites. Try to take a look at what you've learned here and apply it to the other cases for this week.